Good to be back. It's been a little bit since I've put together an episode for you. Today we're going to be talking about Swedish death metal. And this has been something that's been spinning around in my head for a little bit. Very much inspired by a fellow YouTuber. I don't know how long ago he changed the channel name, but Marc with the C is I've yet to have the pleasure of meeting him. He's got a great channel. He's been around for a while now, and so this is very much inspired by his series surrounding Swedish death metal. I think it's entitled "BUZZSAW is the Law," and he's got like I want to say 20 episodes up. It kind of catalogs Swedish death metal. Sort of like here are the pioneers and all the different bands through the years that have been inspired by the likes of Nihilist, Entombed, Dismember, Grave, Unleashed. So, right, because that style of death metal is very popular and has that signature sort of buzzsaw guitar tone. But I was thinking about, for as much attention and inspiration that that sound the country of Sweden has in terms of death metal, I was trying to think of, who has like the most consistent catalog within the country. And that became sort of like, okay, if you had to pick like the best trilogy in all of Swedish death metal, who would you sort of throw out there? Now, people are going to have some immediate answer, and I think the one that you could probably cheat with is saying that if you count Carnage, the first, the Dark Reflections, you could probably include like maybe the Dismember has the best trilogy, but that's technically, cheating. It's a different band, even though they share members. Anyway, but where I was going with that is I really didn't have a great sort of connection with Swedish death metal early on, and I kind of got into it a little bit later in the 2000s, the more versed I became in death metal as a genre as a whole. But a band that I thought was like actually really consistent, they grabbed me much later on. We're listening here in the background. So this is the debut full length came around much later in 2007. This is Demonical, Servants of the Unlight. But I initially thought about putting together a video that would just focus on their Cyclone Empire years. So I hadn't listened to this band for a while, but when this record came out, initially picked it up on CD here in 2007. And I loved it so much I went back and grabbed an LP copy of it. But I really dug this, and kind of felt like they were doing Swedish death metal how I wanted it to be done, in terms of like just straightforward Swedish death metal, no other sort of subgenre tags associated with it.
I am
So that was the initial sort of project, was, hey, how do we talk about the best trilogy in Swedish death metal? I'll kind of shout out Marc with the C, and now I think the Bowels of Retribution is the new channel name. So I will link to Marc's new channel, Bowels of Retribution, and I'll probably even highlight a few of the BUZZSAW a Lot episodes. There's a lot to go through, so if you love Swedish death metal, he's definitely someone to check out and to pay attention to that series. But what I kind of came away with after spending some time with thinking about who has the best trilogy in the genre is just that this seems to be a country that really turned dramatically. And I don't mean in like in the same way as an American sound that got like progressive, like somewhere in the, as death metal started to change in the middle of the 90s and people, you know, potentially sort of bailed from the genre, you know, while Sweden diversified its sound, I think, you know, the death doom scene emerges, the mellow death obviously takes off, and even there's a grindcore scene that sort of towards the end of the 90s into the 2000s. So there's a lot of different ways in terms of death metal and different extreme metals from the genre of that country progress. Death metal, in terms of its heavy hitters, in my opinion, really suffered. And I kind of wanted to focus on that because after milling around this subject, I thought it'd be good to go back and explore Entombed's Wolverine Blues and Dismember's Massive Killing Capacity. Those are two records that were sort of polarizing and shifted the sort of death and roll sound that the country's also become synonymous with. And I thought, while it didn't speak to me back then, maybe my opinions have changed. So before we get into that, I kind of wanted to talk about, you know, my experience getting into a little bit of death metal and why those albums serve to be so polarizing, given when I got into the genre and kind of what I wanted from death metal back in the mid to late 90s. So when I was, you know, we're talking about the late 90s here, I'm still very much, what do you want to call it, mid-teenager. I'm getting ready to leave middle school into high school. And Sweden and the bands that were coming out of the country were incredibly important, specifically in the crust punk scene, in terms of making a transition from the kind of punk that I was listening to at the time into a heavier sound overall. So like right now, in the background, I've got this is the debut release, or debut, actually full album from Wolfpack, Lycanthropunk. This band started to be incredibly important to me. In fact, both of these actually very much were. But, you know, I was kind of making a transition from the likes of, let's say, Poison Idea, into something like this. So I liked the Swedish sound, but I was definitely coming from like a bit more of a crust punk background when I was first getting into sort of what the country had to offer in the late 90s. Now, in this time period, as I started making a transition to death metal, probably the two most important death metal bands for me that I sort of immediately latched onto and sort of pursued other bands that were inspired by their sound were American bands Morbid Angel and Suffocation. Altars of Madness, Blessed of the Sick, and then Effigy. Now, I know Bring the Spawn's kind of a controversial choice, but I loved Pierce from Within, and this we're talking, for me, someone who's kind of coming late to that early portion of their catalog. So we're talking, late 90s here. Just by comparison, I think, Lycanthropunk's 1998, I want to say. I think that was kind of like a breath of fresh air for me, was like, okay, I'm getting to this different genre and it's altogether a fundamentally different sound. It just was a kind of the transition I wanted, I guess, out of extreme music. So if I was going to get into death metal, I didn't want anything that sounded punkish, right? I wanted something that sounded death metal when it was decidedly different. So with that being said, the thing that sort of I think helped my fascination with that band, or bands I should say, for Morbid Angel and Suffocation, had relatively consistent catalogs. So from the, you want to say Altus of Madness in 89, all the way through Heretic in 2002, I believe. That's an 8-album run. Now, I think you're going to find people who may have varying opinions on those 8 records, but there's no dramatic, they didn't completely ruin their sound. I know some of the later, the records came later, Morbid Angel catalog, it probably a little bit more controversial and polarizing, but I think it's a relatively consistent 8-album run there. And Suffocation, on the other hand, they have, while you kind of, potentially you can, because of the production issues on Breeding, there's a lull between Pierced and Salted and Deny, which kind of emerges 9 years later, as I want to say, in 2004. It's not a major drop-off, While they were inactive, I think there were tons of bands who were inspired by them that emerged in the late 90s and early 2000s, and when Salted and Die comes back in 2004, I'm hungry for it. The self-titled comes out in 06, and I think it's kind of a sneaker record that a lot of people probably should check out if you like Suffocation. And then Blood Oath in 09 is a great follow-up as well. Maybe they aren't the classic records, but they don't also make this sort of, dramatic stylistic shift, to my ears at least. You can probably criticize the records as, either being, in Suffocation's case, probably not as inventive or a bit more predictable, kind of like, hey, this is kind of the same sound over and over. And for Morbid Angel, you have, changes in lineups, most notably between vocalists that, Vincent Tucker era kind of stuff, but and Trey's sort of experimentation with guitar technique and varying production. But both those bands, I think, because they had a relative catalog that was fairly consistent, helped to sort of carry them from the time period I was introduced in the genre in the late 90s into the 2000s. And I think that serves as a great sort of transition point when we can talk about the crux of this video, right? Which is what happens with Dismember and Entombed. I thought it would be an interesting experiment, now having, decades of experience with death metal, to kind of go back. If I could recontextualize those records maybe and come to it with a different set of ears, potentially I'd have a different sort of interpretation of what those albums had to offer. So that was a major sort of goal, I want to say. was that I might have been missing something, and if I had any sort of a broader lens to work with, or a little bit of distance from this initial sort of influx of a genre into my life, maybe I wouldn't be as sort of critical, or I don't know, wouldn't be so repelled by that sort of rock interpretation of death metal. And I thought maybe a good way to approach that would be to rewind the clock, even go past Entombed and Dismember to a different time period in Swedish extreme metal history. So this is where I was going. I thought it'd be important at least to bring up potentially one of the most, well, maybe not a heavy metal band. You listen to this track, so that we're on side B here of Anti-CMX. So I don't know if this is classified technically as their first full length, the first LP. But man, by comparison to some of their crust stuff that came on, much earlier in the 80s, yes, this is a crust punk band, but you listen to a track like Painkiller, and to me, you start to see a through line, a connection to something like Motorhead. And if that's the sort of band that gets this whole thing rolling, that we get Motorhead influence onto the Swedish crust scene, which in turn pushes essentially opportunity for the world of Swedish death metal. I mean, listen to that. If that's not a little bit of a rock and roll influence via Motorhead, I don't know what is. Now, obviously, Motorhead's one of those bands that connects punk to metal and so on and so forth, so I'm not surprised to find them here, but man, it's probably worth noting, right? Like, I don't know if this was something that Entombed and Dismember were explicitly trying to introduce into their sound, just by being inspired by, the Swedish crust scene that had become more rock and roll oriented versus their like earlier more brutal anarchist crust stuff. But to me, I absolutely hear at least a similarity in terms of where their influences lie. Such a good band. And I guess what I was hoping was that I would look back in that time period after listening to, this album or listen to a track like Painkiller and try and reinterpret those late 90s, early 2000s and glean something from the death and roll area of Swedish death that I potentially had not heard before. So, when I think about Swedish death metal that time period, like I said, I was getting a little bit more into like the bands who were inspired by Suffocation and Morbid Angel. Now, in the American scene, you had bands like Deeds of Flesh or Angel Corpse, which I very much felt were like kind of taking up the mantle for Morbid Angel and Suffocation. But, in Sweden, I think they'd kind of dipped their toes a little bit into that sound. So it wasn't just all death and roll, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So probably candidates from that country that are worth mentioning for me. So this is the debut album from Vomitory. I mean, with an album titled Raped in Their Own Blood, but they're definitely like tapping into the brutal American sound. Like, it's kind of whatever, a stupid album title for me to listen to, I guess, now. But more importantly, like, when I was, this is 96, I believe, 95, 96. Yeah, I wanted this from death metal, and by the time I got to it at the end of the 90s, and I know that can kind of seem like whatever, ridiculous to be into something like this, but it was a decided turn away from like the crust punk, and I was kind of interested more in the gruesome, brutal stuff. And the other side of that is like the technical stuff. So this is the second full length, I believe, from Sweden's Anata, Dreams of Death and Dismay. People keep talking about this band putting out a new record. I don't believe you. But both of these bands, I thought, actually, specifically, didn't take long for Vomitory to get scooped up, I believe, from Metal Blade Records. I don't know if it was their second or third length that finally went over to like a larger label. But this is on a much smaller release label, I should say. Fadeless Records put this out. I want to say Anata initially, I was on, I guess, on Season of Mist for European distribution, and I became aware of them when they got excuse me, Relapse distribution in the States. And both great bands. I mean, this is some of the best, in my opinion. Anata is the defining tech death record, or band, I should say, of the era, of the late 90s, early 2000s, in my opinion. But we've got Wolverine here, blues playing in the background, and that's what we're kind of talking about. So, yeah, like I'm saying, like, there are a lot of great, very consistent, death metal bands coming out of Sweden, but I think there's usually some other, tag associated with them, right? Like, as much as I enjoyed this Anata stuff, it's tech death from the late 90s, early 2000s. A band like Rune Magic is a good example. One that I thought was fairly consistent, but they're very much a death doom band purely. I think in terms of name recognition, Entombed and Dismember put out arguably two of the best death metal records ever. They are frontrunners, and I never really got into, this may be blasphemous to say, I never really got into, Grave. Nihilist is like an important band for Swedish death metal history, but they don't have a left-hand path on their in their catalog. I never got into Hypocrisy. I know Unleashed, like early Unleashed, their debut record's great, but for me, it's Entombed and Dismember are like on the throne of not just Swedish death metal, but you could argue, I think, Left Hand Path and Like an Ever-Flowing Stream are arguably the best death metal records ever. I mean, that's gonna, for me, like, that might not be the case, but I think fans of the genre can take that claim, and I don't think anyone's gonna take issue with it. That's why I think Wolverine Blues and Massive Killing Capacity are so important. Is here you have frontrunners who are really epitomize what the country has to offer in terms of death metal, and they make this kind of a turn. I mean, I don't necessarily dislike it altogether. It just feels like such a diversion from what had made them important. And not in a way like, Death's Human, for example. This feels like it is kind of heading in an opposite direction historically that doesn't feel like a logical progression in terms of their sound. And I was kind of hoping that after listening to the likes of Anti-C-Mix, that's what I would hear, is a logical progression. That's something that was always inherent within their music that maybe was distilled later on. And I just don't quite get there with Wolverine Blues. So in the end, where am I going with this? No, I didn't really get into Wolverine Blues. And here we've got massive killing capacity in the background. What am I trying to say? Did Swedish death metal have the biggest flame out in death metal history? I mean, I know that's a controversial statement, but we're talking, you know, no sort of, I get that I just brought up like kind of the more technical death metal kind of side of that kind of Sweden, like the death doom stuff. Mellow death was huge, but with no other sort of subgenre tags, we talk about the most important pioneers. You know, who is Sweden's Immolation? There's no Swedish death metal band that has a relatively consistent 8-album sort of run. You know, it's not just like Vader is another example. Sure, there are some albums that are better than others, but another band like Immolation that's had a relatively consistent career. And these are also like remaining well underground, sort of appreciated bands, but also visible and successful in a way that I think within the death metal community are sort of a well-known household, if you will, name. I don't think Sweden have a band like that. Out of the Entomb, Dismember, Unleashed, Hypocrisy, you know, Sentinex, I brought up, you know, Demonical earlier, and they're a band that, you know, maybe was a bit more, you know, successful, or they don't have quite the kind of drop off, but they are not as visible as Suffocation and Morbid Angel. That's fair to say. And Sweden is such a pivotal country to the history of death metal. Outside of America, probably the second country that comes to anyone's mind when you think about geographic sort of contributions to the history of the genre. And yet, for me, as it almost dies as soon as it sort of arrives. It's a very interesting sort of country, and I don't know. People are going to probably light me up in the comments talking about how important Sweden is to death metal's history, because it is. But it seems to me an incredibly sort of short-lived peak. Maybe I'm hating on this death and roll stuff more than people out there think I should be, or it deserves to be sort of dismissed. But I never really quite got behind this stuff, and here I'm thinking that 20 years later, somehow I'm going to connect with it and have a greater appreciation for it. It doesn't really click for me still. So I guess I'll end this video with like, who do you think has the best trilogy in death metal history, or in Swedish death metal history, I should say. And, you know, what are your opinions on sort of the advent or origins of this sort of death and roll out of the country? Do you think I need to just realize that it is actually something, a direction that the country was always going? Do you feel it's a betrayal of what was probably one of the most artistically important periods and geographic contributions to the history of the genre? I don't know. For me, I can't get behind it, and maybe people out there would love it. It's not for me. 20 years later, still disappointed. But I thought this would be an interesting, at least, conversation to go back and explore this, trying to give a little bit more context maybe than some people will often sort of jump to when you think about Death and Roll, and two sort of iconic records for sort of making a sharp turn away from the classic Swedish death metal sound. So I will leave in this video below, there will be some links to Marc with C's new channel. Let me get it right here. The Bowels of Retribution. Some of the videos, if you are a fans of all things HM2 guitar, buzzsaw tone, he's got like I think 20 videos, 18, 19, maybe 20 videos that just kind of give you a pretty, catalog all the different bands that sort of are playing with this sound. If you don't like death and roll, but you can't get enough Swedish death metal, he's a great channel to check out. So once again, shout out to Marc with a C for getting this sort of the origins for this video going. I'll see you guys later. You can always catch me on Album Club on Wednesdays on the Heavy Metallurgy channel. Every once in a while, if something speaks to me, I'll do a review for the channel as well. But this has been a glimpse into my experience with death and roll from Sweden in the mid-90s. 2 decades later, still not my thing. Let me know why I'm wrong. Put it up in the comments below. I'll see you guys later.